Welcome, weary traveler, to a quiet journey through time. Tonight, we'll gently unfurl the tapestries of medieval Europe, a world long past, and explore a profound turning point in its history. The quiet ripple of change brought by a distant whisper, often called the Black Death. This isn't a tale for alarm, but a soft exploration, an invitation to simply listen, to let the words wash over you, and to slowly drift into a peaceful slumber. We'll meander through forgotten villages, past sleeping castles, and witness the quiet shifts that transformed a continent. You don't need to remember every detail, just let the rhythm of the story guide you. Perhaps you'll find comfort in the gentle cadence of history, as we explore how even in times of great challenge, the human spirit, with quiet resilience, found new paths. Let your mind unwind, your breath deepen, and allow yourself to sink into the quiet comfort of your bed. Picture yourself walking along a moonlit path through time, where shadows dance softly and the air carries whispers of centuries past. The stones beneath your feet have witnessed countless stories, and tonight, they share their secrets with you in hushed tones. Feel the gentle breeze that carries the scent of old parchment and distant hearth fires. We'll begin our journey in the distant lands where the first whispers of change stirred, far from the bustling markets and sleepy hamlets of Europe. Imagine the vast expanses of rolling hills and quiet forests, where time moves differently, where each moment stretches like honey from a wooden spoon. As we travel together through this peaceful narrative, let your shoulders relax, let your breathing slow and deepen. There's no urgency here, no need to hurry. We have all the time in the world to explore these gentle currents of history. Each word is a soft step on our shared path, each sentence a comfortable pause to rest and reflect. The story we're about to unfold is one of transformation, but not the kind that startles or disturbs. Rather, it's like watching the slow change of seasons, the gradual shift from summer's warmth to autumn's golden embrace. It's the story of how a distant ripple became a wave that gently reshaped the shores of an entire continent. So settle in, dear listener. Pull your blankets closer, let the pillow cradle your head, and prepare to drift along with the current of time. Just relax and let the story unfold. Let us first gently paint a picture of medieval Europe, a world of earthen paths and stone churches, where the rhythm of life was tied to the turning of the seasons. Imagine quiet fields stretching to the horizon, dotted with sleeping farmhouses, their thatched roofs glowing softly in the amber light of dawn. This was a world that moved at the pace of oxen pulling plows, where the ringing of church bells marked not just the hours, but the very heartbeat of community life. Picture the gentle morning mist rising from fertile valleys, where farmers would soon emerge from their humble dwellings to tend their crops with the same care their fathers and grandfathers had shown before them. In these peaceful villages, life followed patterns as old as memory itself. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm, not harsh or jarring, but like a distant drum keeping time for the day's activities. Children played in dusty streets with simple toys carved from wood, their laughter floating on the warm air like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. The great manor houses sat quietly among their lands, their stone walls weathered by centuries of gentle rain and soft snowfall. Lords and ladies moved through their daily routines with the same measured pace as their tenants, bound together in a web of obligation and tradition that stretched back through generations uncounted. Market days brought a gentle bustle to the village squares, where merchants spread their wares on wooden tables and farmers brought their surplus grain and vegetables. The conversations were unhurried, punctuated by friendly laughter and the soft bleating of sheep being led to pasture. Money changed hands slowly. Relationships were built over years of quiet interaction, and trust was earned through countless small kindnesses. The churches stood at the heart of every community, their spires reaching toward heaven like fingers pointing the way to peace. Inside these sacred spaces, candles flickered quietly, casting dancing shadows on stone walls that had absorbed centuries of whispered prayers. The Latin chants of the priests rose and fell like gentle waves, providing comfort and continuity to souls seeking solace. Monasteries dotted the countryside like islands of contemplation, where monks in brown robes moved silently through their daily prayers and labor. In their scriptoriums, patient scribes bent over parchment, copying sacred texts with careful strokes of their quills. The only sounds were the soft scratch of pen on paper and the distant tolling of bells calling the faithful to prayer. The forests surrounding these communities were places of quiet mystery, where sunlight filtered through ancient oak and beech trees, creating cathedral-like spaces filled with dappled light. Pilgrims traveled the old Roman roads, their feet following paths worn smooth by countless generations of travelers seeking spiritual renewal or simply a change of scene. In the great halls of castles, evening meals were communal affairs where stories were shared over simple fare. The lord might tell tales of distant lands or recent hunts, while musicians played soft melodies on lutes and harps that seemed to weave themselves into the very stones of the walls. Women worked their looms in the afternoon light, their shuttles moving back and forth in hypnotic rhythm, creating cloth that would warm their families through the cold months ahead. Children learned their letters from patient tutors, their young voices reciting lessons that connected them to the wisdom of ages past. The agricultural cycle governed all life, from the spring planting to the autumn harvest. Seasons flowed into one another like movements in a gentle symphony, each bringing its own tasks and rewards. Summer brought long days of labor in the fields, but also evening festivals where communities gathered to celebrate their shared abundance. Trade flowed along established routes, like streams following their ancient courses. Merchants knew each other by name, and goods moved from town to town carried by trusted hands. The pace was unhurried. Relationships mattered more than quick profit, and honor was the currency that truly counted. As the sun quietly set on these familiar scenes, whispers from far-off lands were beginning to stir. Let's gently turn our attention now to those distant horizons. Our journey now takes us eastward, beyond the familiar landscapes of Europe, to the vast, quiet stretches of Central Asia. Here, amidst the gentle sway of grasslands and the distant hum of ancient caravanserai, the first tiny seeds of change were stirring. Picture the endless steppes of Mongolia and Central Asia, where the horizon stretches like a silk cloth under an endless sky. Here, the wind carries stories across thousands of miles, whispering secrets to the hardy grasses that bend but never break. This was a land of nomads and traders, where the rhythm of life was measured not in church bells, but in the soft footfalls of camels and horses crossing ancient paths. The Silk Road wound through this landscape like a gentle river, connecting distant worlds through quiet commerce and patient travel. Caravans moved at the pace of their slowest members, taking months to complete journeys that would bind together civilizations separated by vast distances. The merchants who traveled these routes were patient souls, understanding that true wealth came not from speed, but from the careful cultivation of relationships across cultural boundaries. In the bustling cities of Samarkand and Bokhara, where East met West in peaceful exchange, the air was filled with the soft murmur of a dozen languages blending together like instruments in a distant orchestra. Here, Chinese silk merchants shared tea with Persian carpet weavers, while Indian spice traders discussed routes with Venetian adventurers seeking new opportunities. The Great Khan's empire stretched across these lands like a protective blanket, bringing order and stability to regions that had known only tribal warfare. Under Mongol rule, the Pax Mongolica created safe passage for merchants and ideas alike, allowing goods and knowledge to flow freely along the ancient trade routes. This was a time when a single coin could travel from Beijing to Baghdad, changing hands dozens of times but always retaining its value. Deep in the heart of these vast territories, among the communities of marmot hunters and felt makers, something barely noticeable was beginning to stir. It was subtle, like a change in the wind that only the most sensitive might detect. The hardy people of the steppes, accustomed to the harsh realities of their environment, adapted to this new challenge with the same quiet resilience their ancestors had shown for generations. The first whispers of change began to travel along the trade routes, carried not by any single messenger, but by the natural flow of commerce and human movement. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water, these subtle alterations in the normal patterns of life began to spread outward from their point of origin. In the great trading posts along the Silk Road, where merchants gathered to rest and resupply, conversations began to include new topics. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of changes in distant communities, of the need for new precautions, of routes that might need to be adjusted. But these were practical discussions, handled with the same matter-of-fact approach that seasoned merchants brought to all challenges. The Buddhist monasteries scattered across these lands continued their ancient practices of meditation and learning, their monks copying texts and preserving knowledge with the same careful attention they had always shown. In their quiet halls, the sound of chanting continued to rise and fall like breathing, creating spaces of peace that seemed to exist outside of time itself. As the seasons turned and the great wheel of trade continued its ancient rotation, the subtle changes began to manifest in the daily routines of the trading communities. Certain goods became more precious, certain routes required new considerations, and the experienced merchants who had spent lifetimes learning to read the subtle signs of change began to adapt their practices accordingly. The nomadic peoples of the steppes, those masters of adaptation who had survived and thrived in one of the world's most challenging environments, began to make quiet adjustments to their seasonal migrations. Like skilled sailors reading the wind, they sensed the need for subtle changes in their ancient patterns, modifications so small that only those who lived closest to the land would notice. In the yurts scattered across the vast grasslands, families continued their traditional crafts of felt-making and leatherworking, but conversations around the evening fires began to include new topics. Elders shared wisdom about adaptation and resilience, while younger members of the community listened with the respectful attention that had always characterized these cultural exchanges. The great trading cities began to develop new practices, subtle modifications to their established routines that reflected the changing circumstances. Markets still opened with the same ceremonial fanfare, but merchants began to employ new precautions, new ways of handling goods, and managing the flow of people through their establishments. As winter approached across the steppes, the usual preparations took on new dimensions. Communities that had survived countless harsh seasons by planning ahead and working together began to apply their traditional wisdom to new challenges. The same practical approach that had allowed them to thrive in one of the world's most demanding environments now guided their response to these changing circumstances. Slowly, imperceptibly, these distant movements began to draw closer. Let's gently follow the threads now, as they weave their way westward towards the shores of the Mediterranean. Imagine now the soft lapping of waves against the docks of a bustling port city, perhaps Messina or Venice. It was here, amidst the gentle creak of ship timbers and the calls of seabirds, that the first subtle echoes of something new began to arrive. The Mediterranean ports of the 14th century were places where worlds converged in peaceful harmony. Picture the morning mist rising from the harbor waters, where ships from distant lands rocked gently at anchor, their masts swaying like tall reeds in a summer breeze. The air was filled with the mingled scents of salt spray, exotic spices, and the warm bread baking in the portside taverns where sailors and merchants gathered to share tales of their journeys. In the great port of Genoa, where Christopher Columbus would one day dream of westward voyages, the docks stretched along the curved shoreline like welcoming arms embracing the sea. Here, Venetian galleys unloaded their precious cargoes of silk and spices, while Byzantine traders examined bolts of fine cloth in the gentle morning light. The merchants moved with unhurried purpose, their conversations conducted in the mixture of languages that had become the natural dialect of Mediterranean commerce. The harbor masters maintained their careful records with the same methodical attention their predecessors had shown for generations. Each arriving vessel was noted in ledgers bound in fine leather, their cargoes cataloged with the precision that made Mediterranean trade the envy of the known world. These were men who understood that commerce flowed like water, finding its level through patience and careful attention to detail. Along the waterfront, the great trading houses stood like monuments to successful commerce. The Medici banks, with their careful attention to both profit and reputation, conducted their business with the same quiet efficiency that had made them trusted names from London to Constantinople. Inside their counting houses, clerks worked by candlelight, their quills scratching softly across parchment as they recorded the endless flow of transactions that bound together the commercial world. The arrival of each new ship was an event that rippled gently through the port community. Dock workers, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor, unloaded cargo with the careful attention that valuable goods deserved. Bales of silk were handled like sleeping infants, while chests of spices were opened with reverence due to treasures from distant lands. In the taverns and inns that clustered around the harbor, sailors shared stories of their voyages over cups of warm wine and bowls of hearty stew. These were tales of distant shores and strange customs, of storms weathered and safe harbors found, told in the unhurried cadence of men who had learned to find comfort in the sharing of experience. The great merchant families of Venice maintained their palazzos along the Grand Canal like floating jewels, their marble facades reflecting the gentle ripples of the water. Inside these magnificent homes, business was conducted with the ceremonial dignity that had made Venetian commerce legendary. Contracts were signed with elaborate flourishes, sealed with wax that bore the proud emblems of houses whose names were known from the Baltic to the Black Sea. As spring turned to summer in that fateful year, the usual rhythms of port life continued their ancient dance. Ships arrived and departed with the regularity of tides, their holds filled with the goods that connected distant worlds. The lighthouse keepers maintained their vigilant watch, their beacons cutting through the darkness to guide vessels safely home. Yet in the midst of this familiar activity, subtle changes began to manifest. Certain ships arrived with smaller crews than expected, their captains speaking in hushed tones of difficulties encountered during their voyages. The port physicians, those learned men who had always been called upon to treat the minor ailments common to seafaring life, found themselves consulted more frequently, their services in demand for conditions that seemed somehow different from the usual complaints. The merchant communities, those close-knit networks of traders who had built their success on careful observation and quick adaptation, began to notice patterns that were almost too subtle to define. Certain trade routes experienced minor disruptions, certain goods became slightly more difficult to obtain, and certain partnerships required new considerations. In the scriptoriums of the port cities, where learned men maintained correspondence with colleagues across the known world, letters began to arrive that spoke of changes in distant lands. These were not dramatic reports, but rather the quiet observations of scholars and merchants who had trained themselves to notice the subtle shifts that preceded larger changes. The great libraries of Alexandria and Constantinople, those repositories of ancient wisdom, continued their work of preservation and study. Monks and scholars bent over their manuscripts with the same careful attention they had always shown, but their conversations began to include references to new challenges that required the application of old wisdom to unprecedented circumstances. The guilds that regulated trade in the port cities maintained their ancient traditions of mutual support and shared responsibility. Master craftsmen continued to train their apprentices with the same patient attention that had built their reputations, while guild halls echoed with discussions of how traditional practices might need to adapt to changing circumstances. In the Jewish quarters of the great port cities, where communities had learned to thrive despite centuries of displacement, the ancient traditions of learning and mutual aid took on new relevance. Rabbis and scholars consulted their texts for guidance, while community leaders organized assistance for those who needed additional support during these subtly changing times. The great cathedral schools, where the finest minds of the age gathered to study theology and philosophy, began to grapple with questions that had no precedent in their traditional curricula. Students and masters engaged in the kind of careful debate that had always characterized scholastic inquiry, but their discussions now included considerations of how divine providence might manifest itself in ways that challenged human understanding. As summer deepened and the trading season reached its height, the port cities maintained their role as bridges between worlds. The same ships that had always carried goods now also carried information, stories, and subtle changes in the patterns of life that connected distant communities. The experienced merchants who had built their fortunes on careful observation began to make quiet adjustments to their practices, modifications so subtle that only those closest to the trade would notice. From these gentle coastal landings, the quiet tide began to move inland. Let's drift now into the heart of the continent and see how these whispers began to touch the sleeping countryside. Leaving the bustling ports behind, our journey now takes us to the tranquil heart of the countryside, to sleepy villages nestled amidst rolling hills and winding rivers. Here, life continued its quiet rhythm, though a subtle, almost imperceptible shift was beginning to occur. Picture a typical English village in the soft light of early morning, where thatched cottages line a dusty road like mushrooms after rain. The air is sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh hay, while larks sing their liquid songs from the hedgerows that separate one field from another. This is a world where time moves at the pace of growing things, where seasons matter more than hours, and where the community gathers around the parish church like chicks around a protective hen. In the great manor house that overlooks the village, the Lord and his family maintain the same routines their ancestors have followed for generations uncounted. The morning begins with prayers in the private chapel, where colored light filters through stained glass windows to create pools of ruby and sapphire on the stone floor. The lady of the manor tends to her herb garden with the same careful attention her mother showed, while the Lord walks his lands with the measured pace of a man who sees his property as a sacred trust. The village priest, a gentle soul whose learning was acquired in the cathedral school at Winchester, tends to his flock with the patient care of a shepherd. His sermons are delivered in the rolling cadences of Latin and the mother tongue, weaving together ancient wisdom and practical guidance in ways that comfort and instruct. In the vestry of his small stone church, he maintains the parish records with the careful handwriting that connects this small community to the broader tapestry of Christendom. Market day brings a gentle bustle to the village green, where farmers spread their wares on wooden tables and housewives examine vegetables with the discerning eye of those who waste nothing and value everything. The conversations flow like honey, thick with local dialect and punctuated by comfortable silences. Children play at the edges of the market, their games as old as childhood itself, while dogs drowse in the shade of the great oak that has witnessed centuries of such peaceful gatherings. The miller's wheel turns with hypnotic regularity beside the stream that powers it, grinding grain into flour with the same steady rhythm that has fed this community since time immemorial. The miller himself is a prosperous man, his success built on the trust of neighbors who depend on him to transform their harvest into daily bread. His mill is a place of quiet industry, where the sound of falling water mingles with the whisper of grain being ground between ancient stones. In the cottage workshops that line the village streets, craftsmen pursue their trades with the unhurried skill of those who have learned their arts from fathers and grandfathers. The blacksmith's forge glows like an earthbound star, while his hammer rings out in the steady rhythm that shapes iron into the tools that make rural life possible. The carpenter's plane whispers across oak planks, creating the furniture and farm implements that will serve the community for generations to come. The great fields that surround the village stretch away like a patchwork quilt, each strip carefully tended by families who have worked the same land for centuries. The three-field system rotates crops with the wisdom of ages, allowing the earth to rest and renew itself in cycles as old as agriculture itself. Workers move through the grain with scythes that flash in the sunlight, their movements choreographed by generations of shared labor. Women gather at the village well each morning, their conversations flowing as freely as the water they draw. This is where news travels, where wisdom is shared, and where the small concerns of daily life are woven into the larger tapestry of community support. Children learn the stories of their people here, tales that stretch back to the time when their ancestors first cleared these forests and planted these fields. The village alehouse serves as the informal meeting place where men gather after the day's work is done. Here, over cups of ale brewed from local barley, the business of the community is discussed and decided. The conversations are unhurried, punctuated by thoughtful silences and the occasional burst of laughter that echoes across the village green. As the months passed, subtle changes began to manifest in the rhythms of rural life. Certain village families found themselves taking on additional responsibilities as neighbors required more assistance with their daily tasks. The community response was characteristically practical and immediate, with established networks of mutual aid expanding to meet new needs. The village priest found his pastoral duties taking on new dimensions as parishioners sought additional spiritual guidance. His evening prayers began to include special petitions for the health and well-being of the community, while his sermons explored themes of divine providence and human resilience with renewed urgency. The manor lord, responding to reports from his steward about changes in the productivity of certain holdings, began to make quiet adjustments to the traditional obligations of his tenants. These modifications were implemented with the same careful attention to fairness and sustainability that had characterized the manor's management for generations. The traveling merchants who had always brought news and goods to the village began to report changes in the patterns of trade along their established routes. These were not dramatic disruptions, but rather subtle shifts that required experienced traders to adapt their practices to new circumstances. The village midwife, whose knowledge of healing herbs and traditional remedies had been passed down through generations of women, found herself consulted more frequently for conditions that seemed to require a deeper understanding of the body's responses to unusual challenges. Her cottage garden, already renowned for its medicinal plants, became the focus of renewed attention from community members seeking to expand their knowledge of natural healing. The seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural calendar took on new significance as occasions for community gathering and mutual support. The harvest celebration, with its ancient rituals of thanksgiving and abundance, became a particularly poignant reminder of the interconnectedness that bound the village together. The abbey that served the region from its location in the neighboring valley continued its ancient routines of prayer and contemplation, but the monks found their charitable obligations expanding as more members of the surrounding communities sought assistance. The monastery's stores of grain and preserved foods, maintained as insurance against hard times, were drawn upon with increasing frequency. The great forests that surrounded the agricultural lands provided not only timber and game, but also served as refuges for contemplation and spiritual renewal. Hermits and anchorites who had chosen lives of solitary prayer found themselves serving as informal counselors for villagers seeking guidance during times of uncertainty. The network of roads and paths that connected village to village carried not only the usual traffic of merchants and pilgrims, but also the subtle currents of change that were reshaping rural life across the continent. These ancient routes, some dating back to Roman times, serve as arteries through which new challenges and old wisdom flowed with equal ease. As the plague gently spread its tendrils across the land, it began to touch the very fabric of society. Let's consider now the quiet contemplation and shifts in belief that began to emerge. In the quiet moments, as the world outside softened its pace, people began to turn inward. This was a time for reflection, for gentle contemplation, as thoughts turned to the deeper meanings of life and faith in medieval Europe. Picture the interior of a small village church at twilight, where candles flicker like earthbound stars against stone walls worn smooth by centuries of prayer. The air is thick with incense and whispered devotions, while colored light from stained glass windows creates pools of emerald and gold on the worn flagstones. Here, in these sacred spaces, the faithful gathered not in fear, but in quiet seeking, searching ancient wisdom for guidance through uncertain times. The great cathedral schools, those centers of learning where theology and philosophy intertwined like ivy on ancient walls, became places of deeper inquiry. Scholars who had spent lifetimes studying the works of Augustine and Aquinas found themselves applying familiar principles to unprecedented questions. In the scriptoriums, where monks bent over illuminated manuscripts, discussions arose about the nature of divine providence and the mysterious ways in which the Almighty worked through history. Brother Francis, a gentle soul who tended the monastery garden with the same care he brought to his prayers, found solace in the rhythm of seasons that continued unchanged despite the subtle alterations in human affairs. His small plot of medicinal herbs, chamomile for calming, lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance, became a living prayer book where each plant offered its own lesson in patience and endurance. The University at Paris, that great flowering of medieval scholarship, buzzed with quiet debates conducted in the measured cadences of academic discourse. Students and masters gathered in halls where centuries of learning had polished the wooden benches to a warm glow, their conversations weaving together revelation and reason in the grand tradition of scholastic inquiry. These were not heated arguments, but rather gentle explorations of how eternal truths might illuminate temporal challenges. In the Jewish communities scattered throughout Europe, where learning was prized above wealth and wisdom passed from generation to generation like precious heirlooms, rabbis consulted the Talmud and other sacred texts with renewed intensity. The Beth Midrash, those houses of study where scholarship and prayer merged into a single devotion, echoed with the soft murmur of voices engaged in the ancient practice of textual analysis and spiritual inquiry. The mystics and contemplatives, those souls who had chosen lives of direct communion with the divine, found their hermitages and anchor holds becoming places of pilgrimage for those seeking deeper understanding. Dame Julian of Norwich, in her cell beside the church, received visitors who came not for dramatic revelations, but for the quiet wisdom that flowed from a life dedicated to contemplation. Her gentle insights about divine love and the ultimate goodness of creation offered comfort to souls seeking meaning in challenging times. The great libraries of monasteries across Europe, Cluny, Monte Cassino, St. Gall, became repositories not just of ancient texts, but of contemporary reflection. Monks who served as librarians found themselves cataloging not only the works of the Church Fathers, but also the thoughtful observations of their contemporaries who were wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The Dominican and Franciscan orders, those communities dedicated to combining contemplation with active service, discovered new relevance for their founding principles. The preaching friars found their sermons taking on deeper dimensions as they helped congregations understand how traditional teachings applied to contemporary circumstances. Their words, delivered from simple wooden pulpits in parish churches across the continent, offered reassurance grounded in centuries of Christian wisdom. In the courts of kings and nobles, where chaplains served as spiritual advisors to the powerful, conversations about governance began to include deeper questions about the relationship between earthly authority and divine will. The concept of the divine right of kings took on new complexity as rulers grappled with responsibilities that seemed to extend beyond traditional understanding. The guild halls, where craftsmen gathered to conduct their business and maintain their standards, became places where practical spirituality found expression. The elaborate rituals that governed guild life, the ceremonies of apprenticeship, the feast days that honored patron saints, the charitable obligations that bound members together, took on renewed significance as communities sought stability through traditional practices. Pilgrimage routes that had always carried the faithful to sacred sites like Canterbury and Santiago de Compostela began to see new types of travelers. These were not just those seeking miraculous cures or spiritual adventures, but rather souls pursuing deeper understanding through the ancient practice of walking meditation. The rhythm of footsteps on well-worn paths became a form of prayer, while the hospitality of monasteries and hospices along the way provided opportunities for quiet conversation and shared reflection. The mystery plays performed in cathedral squares and market towns began to explore themes of suffering and redemption with new depth. These dramatic representations of biblical stories, performed by guilds and religious communities, offered audiences opportunities to engage with eternal questions through the familiar medium of communal entertainment. The crowds that gathered to watch these productions found themselves drawn into contemplation of how ancient stories spoke to contemporary experience. The anchoresses, those holy women who chose lives of solitary prayer within the walls of churches, found their counsel increasingly sought by visitors who climbed narrow stone steps to speak with them through small windows. These conversations, conducted in whispers that barely disturbed the sacred silence, offered guidance that emerged from years of contemplative practice and direct spiritual experience. The Book of Hours, those beautifully illuminated prayer books that marked the devotional practices of the literate, began to include new prayers and meditations. These personal volumes, often passed down through families like precious heirlooms, reflected the spiritual needs of their owners while maintaining connection to the broader tradition of Christian devotion. The great theological questions that had always occupied the finest minds of the age, the nature of God's justice, the mystery of suffering, the relationship between faith and reason, took on new urgency as scholars applied traditional methods of inquiry to contemporary challenges. The Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, that great synthesis of Christian doctrine and Aristotelian philosophy, was consulted with renewed attention as readers sought frameworks for understanding their changing world. The Devotio Moderna, that movement toward practical spirituality that emphasized personal relationship with Christ, found new adherents among those seeking authentic religious experience. This approach to faith focused on interior life and ethical living rather than elaborate ceremony, offered a path towards spiritual growth that was accessible to ordinary believers. Cathedral chapters, those communities of clergy who served the great churches of Europe, found their daily rounds of prayer taking on deeper meaning as they maintained the ancient liturgical cycles that had structured Christian worship for centuries. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, created a framework of sanctified time that provided stability and continuity regardless of external circumstances. The writings of the Church Fathers, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory the Great, were copied and recopied in monastery scriptoriums, their ancient wisdom finding new relevance for contemporary readers. These texts, preserved through centuries of careful transmission, offered guidance that had been tested by time and proven valuable across generations of believers. From these quiet reflections, new ideas began to gently blossom. Let's explore now how the practical aspects of daily life began to quietly adapt and evolve. As the quiet tide of change washed over the land, the very rhythms of daily life in medieval Europe began to gently adjust. Imagine the fields, now less burdened by hands, and the quiet shift in the balance between the land and those who worked it. In the golden light of early morning, as mist rises from fertile valleys like prayers ascending to heaven, the countryside reveals a subtle transformation. The same fields that had known the footsteps of countless generations now witness a quiet reordering of ancient patterns. Where once dozens of workers might have moved through the grain like a human tide, smaller groups now tend the same acreage with innovations born of necessity and the gentle wisdom of adaptation. The great manor of Ravenscroft, nestled in a valley where a clear stream meanders between willow trees, exemplifies these quiet changes. Sir William, the manor lord, walks his lands each morning with the measured pace of a man who has learned to see opportunity in challenge. His steward, Master Geoffrey, carries a leather satchel filled with parchments that record new arrangements, agreements that honor tradition while acknowledging changed circumstances. The village of Little Bramwell, where thatched cottages line the road like comfortable old friends, has discovered new rhythms in its daily life. Where families once struggled to maintain subsistence on tiny strips of land, survivors now find themselves tending larger holdings. The transition happens with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing, as community leaders work to ensure that available land serves the common good. Margaret the Weaver, whose cottage stands beside the mill pond where water lilies bloom in summer profusion, represents the quiet prosperity that some craftspeople now enjoy. Her loom, inherited from her mother and grandmother before her, produces cloth of exceptional quality that commands prices her ancestors could never have imagined. The increased demand for her skills allows her to employ 2 apprentices, young women whose eager fingers learn the ancient art while their eyes shine with the possibility of their own prosperous futures. The weekly market in the town of Ashford takes on new characteristics as traditional relationships evolve. Thomas the baker, whose family has provided bread for the community for 5 generations, finds his services more valued than ever. The same loaves that once sold for a penny now command twice that price, not from greed, but from the simple mathematics of supply and demand. Yet Thomas maintains the generous spirit of his forebears, ensuring that no one in the community goes hungry regardless of their ability to pay. The Guild of Carpenters in the city of Northgate discovers that their services are suddenly in great demand. Master Robert, whose workshop echoes with the sounds of saws and planes, now employs 6 journeymen where he once managed with 3. The furniture they create, sturdy oak tables, comfortable chairs, well-crafted chests, finds ready buyers among families who have inherited estates they never expected to possess. In the countryside surrounding the Abbey of St. Ellard, the Cistercian monks adapt their agricultural practices with the same methodical approach they bring to their prayers. Brother Benedict, the cellarer responsible for the monastery's temporal affairs, implements new systems of crop rotation and land management that increase productivity while honoring the Benedictine principle of stability. Their surplus grain, sold in regional markets, provides income that supports both the monastic community and their charitable obligations to local villages. The merchants of the Hanseatic League, those pragmatic traders who have built commercial networks spanning from London to Novgorod, discover new opportunities in the changed economic landscape. Master Heinrich of Lübeck, whose warehouses store goods from across the known world, adapts his business practices to serve markets where traditional hierarchies have softened. His ships carry not only the luxury goods that have always moved along trade routes, but also practical items that newly prosperous families can now afford. The Jewish banking houses, particularly those in cities like Cologne and Speyer, find their financial services increasingly essential as communities reorganize their economic relationships. Reuben ben Abraham, whose family has provided loans and currency exchange for 3 generations, develops new instruments of credit that help survivors invest in their futures. His careful records, maintained in Hebrew script on fine parchment, document the quiet emergence of a more fluid social structure. The royal court of France, that glittering center of medieval power, begins to grapple with fiscal realities that require new approaches to governance. King Philip's counselors, meeting in the same chambers where their predecessors planned crusades and negotiated treaties, now devise tax policies that acknowledge changed relationships between crown and subjects. The elaborate ceremonies that have always surrounded royal power continue unchanged, but the practical business of government adapts to serve a realm where traditional assumptions no longer apply. The cathedral builders of Amiens, whose ancestors began their great work generations ago, discover that their specialized skills command unprecedented compensation. Master Pierre, the stone carver whose chisel creates faces of angels that seem to breathe, employs apprentices from across Europe who come to learn techniques that are now more valuable than gold. The great church continues to rise, but at a pace that reflects both the reduced workforce and the increased prosperity of those who possess the skills to continue the work. The village of Whitmore, where the parish church sits like a hen surrounded by cottage chicks, experiences a gentle redistribution of responsibilities and resources. The village reeve, elected by his neighbors to manage community affairs, implements new systems of crop sharing and labor allocation that ensure everyone benefits from increased productivity. The decisions are made at village meetings held in the churchyard, where discussions proceed with the unhurried deliberation that has always characterized rural democracy. The urban workshops of Florence, where silk weavers create fabrics that rival the finest Eastern imports, operate under new arrangements that benefit both masters and workers. Giovanni Di Marco, whose family workshop occupies 3 floors of a stone building near the Arno, shares his increased profits with skilled workers whose expertise becomes more precious each day. The beautiful textiles they produce find markets among merchants and nobles who compete for goods that are no longer abundant. The wine merchants of Bordeaux, whose cellars store vintages from vineyards that have been cultivated since Roman times, discover that their products command premium prices in markets where survivors have inherited unexpected wealth. Master Elan, whose nose can distinguish between vintages with the precision of a scholar reading manuscripts, employs coopers and clerks who share in the prosperity that flows from their specialized knowledge. The monastery of Cluny, that great center of Benedictine reform, adaptates its economic practices to serve changed circumstances while maintaining its spiritual mission. The abbot, Dom Geoffrey, implements new policies for managing the monastery's vast holdings that increase productivity while honoring the rule of Saint Benedict. The monastery scriptorium continues to produce illuminated manuscripts, but now these beautiful books command prices that support both the community's needs and expanded charitable activities. The fishing villages along the North Sea coast, where families have drawn their livelihood from dangerous waters for generations beyond memory, find new prosperity as their skills become scarce and valuable. Captain Magnus, whose boat has weathered storms that claimed lesser vessels, now employs crews who share more generously in the profits from catches that feed communities where food has become precious. The salt merchants of Cheshire, whose product preserves food and seasons life throughout northern England, discover that their mineral wealth translates into social advancement. Master Edmund, whose family has worked the salt mines for generations, now owns properties that his grandfather could never have imagined possessing. Yet he maintains the careful stewardship that has always characterized his trade, ensuring that this essential commodity remains available to all who need it. With these quiet shifts in the world of work and resources, the quiet whispers of new opportunities began to emerge. Let's explore now the subtle blossoming of new thoughts and expressions. Even in times of quiet introspection, the human spirit finds gentle ways to express itself. Imagine the soft glow of a candle illuminating a scribe's parchment, or the gentle brushstrokes of a painter. In medieval Europe, new artistic and literary expressions began to softly bloom. In the hushed stillness of the scriptorium at the Abbey of St. Denis, where colored light filters through ancient windows to create pools of sapphire and gold on worn stone floors, Brother Anselm bends over his illuminated manuscript with the devotion of a soul who sees divine beauty in every carefully formed letter. His quill, cut from a swan's feather and blessed by the abbot himself, moves across the vellum with the rhythm of prayer, creating text that will survive centuries while preserving the wisdom of ages. The art of illumination, that marriage of word and image that transforms simple books into windows to heaven, takes on new dimensions as monks find themselves with more time for contemplative creation. Each initial letter becomes a garden of intricate design, where mythical beasts dance among flowering vines, and sacred scenes unfold in margins that seem to breathe with life. The pigments themselves, ultramarine blue ground from lapis lazuli carried by patient merchants across impossible distances, gold leaf beaten thin as whispers, vermilion red derived from cinnabar, become more precious and are used with greater reverence. Master Guillaume, the master mason overseeing the continued construction of Chartres Cathedral, discovers that the changed circumstances of his time allow for innovations in both technique and design. The great church, rising like a prayer made manifest in stone, incorporates new elements that reflect the deeper spirituality of the age. The rose windows, those magnificent circles of colored glass that transform sunlight into divine revelation, are designed with mathematical precision that speaks to both the mind and the soul. Each piece of glass, carefully selected and positioned, creates harmonies of color that change with the passage of the sun across the sky. In the castle of Vincennes, where the French court maintains its elaborate rituals of power and ceremony, the art of tapestry weaving reaches new heights of sophistication. Dame Marguerite, the master weaver whose designs adorn the walls of royal chambers, creates narrative tapestries that tell stories of both earthly and celestial kingdoms. Her workshop, where young women work at great looms with the concentration of scholars, produces textiles that are more than mere decoration. They are books written in thread and dye, preserving stories that will educate and inspire future generations. The troubadours of Provence, those wandering poets whose songs carry stories and emotions across the landscape of medieval Europe, find their art taking on deeper resonances. Sir Bertrand de Born, whose lute accompanies verses that speak of love both human and divine, discovers that his audiences hunger for poetry that addresses the fundamental questions of existence. His songs, performed in castle halls and monastery gardens, weave together the earthly and the eternal in melodies that linger in memory long after the last notes fade into silence. The great libraries of Europe, those at Monte Cassino, Cluny, and the new university at Oxford, become centers not just of preservation, but of innovation in the arts of the book. The librarians, those learned men who serve as guardians of human knowledge, develop new systems of organization and copying that ensure the survival of ancient wisdom while making room for contemporary insights. Their catalogs, written in careful Latin script, record not just the titles of books, but the ideas they contain, creating intellectual maps that guide future scholars through the treasures of human thought. In the workshops of Paris, where craftsmen create the luxury goods that adorn the homes of the prosperous, new techniques in metalworking and jewelry making emerge from the marriage of necessity and opportunity. Master Pierre the goldsmith, whose family has served the nobility for generations, develops new methods of working precious metals that allow him to create objects of unprecedented beauty and complexity. His chalices and reliquaries, destined for churches and private chapels, combine technical mastery with spiritual vision in ways that elevate craft to the level of art. The mystery plays performed in cathedral squares and market towns evolve into more sophisticated forms of dramatic expression. The Guild of Carpenters in York, responsible for the play depicting Noah's Ark, develops new techniques of stagecraft that make their biblical drama more vivid and emotionally compelling. Their performances, drawing audiences from across the region, combine entertainment with education in ways that make ancient stories immediate and relevant to contemporary life. The art of fresco painting, that technique of applying pigment to wet plaster that creates images that become part of the wall itself, flourishes in the churches and monasteries of Italy. Master Giotto, working in the Arena Chapel at Padua, develops new approaches to depicting human emotion and divine grace that will influence artists for centuries to come. His scenes from the life of Christ, painted with a humanity and immediacy that was revolutionary for its time, speak to viewers in ways that transcend the boundaries of language and culture. The school at Chartres, where scholars pursue the study of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, becomes a center for the integration of classical learning with contemporary observation. The masters and students, working in halls where the wisdom of Aristotle mingles with the insights of contemporary thinkers, develop new approaches to understanding the natural world that will eventually bloom into what later ages will call the scientific method. The art of stained glass, that uniquely medieval achievement that transforms churches into jewel boxes of colored light, reaches new heights of technical and artistic sophistication. The glaziers of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, working under the patronage of King Louis IX, developed techniques for creating glass of unprecedented clarity and color. Their windows, depicting scenes from the Old and New Testaments, create environments where the boundaries between earth and heaven seem to dissolve in floods of sacred light. The vernacular literatures of Europe begin to flourish as writers discover that their native languages can carry truths as profound as those expressed in Latin. Dante Alighieri, working in his study in Florence, where the Arno River reflects the changing light of Tuscan skies, composes his Divine Comedy in the Italian vernacular, creating a work that will define the possibilities of poetry for all future generations. His journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise becomes a map of the human soul that speaks to readers across the centuries. The art of music, that most ethereal of human expressions, undergoes subtle but significant evolution in the choirs and scriptoriums of medieval Europe. The Gregorian chant, that ancient form of liturgical music that has sustained Christian worship for centuries, is enriched by new forms of polyphony that allow multiple voices to weave together in harmonies of unprecedented complexity. The Abbey of St. Martial in Limoges becomes a center for musical innovation, where monks develop new forms of notation that preserve their compositions for future generations. The craft of manuscript copying, that essential work of preserving and transmitting human knowledge, benefits from innovations in both materials and techniques. The papermaking techniques introduced from the Islamic world begin to supplement the traditional use of parchment, making books more affordable and accessible. The University of Bologna, that great center of legal studies, becomes a pioneer in the production of texts that serve the needs of a growing class of educated professionals. The art of sculpture, from the great tympana that adorn cathedral doorways to the delicate ivory carvings that grace private devotional objects, reflects the deepening spiritual sensibilities of the age. The sculptors of Rheims Cathedral, working in stone that will endure for centuries, create figures that seem to breathe with life while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their sacred setting. Their angels and saints, carved with technical mastery that rivals the achievements of classical antiquity, serve as mediators between the human and divine realms. The tradition of courtly romance, those stories of chivalric adventure and idealized love that circulate among the nobility of Europe, evolves to address deeper questions about the nature of honor, duty, and spiritual transformation. The Arthurian legends, retold by writers like Wolfram von Eschenbach and Crétin de Troyes, become vehicles for exploring the relationship between earthly knighthood and spiritual quest, between human love and divine grace. The art of heraldry, that system of symbols and colors that identifies noble families and their allegiances, develops into a complex visual language that communicates both lineage and values. The heralds, those experts in the interpretation of armorial bearings, create designs that serve as more than mere identification. They become artistic statements that reflect the aspirations and achievements of their bearers. The architectural innovations of the Gothic style, with its soaring vaults and flying buttresses, reach full maturity in cathedrals that seem to defy the laws of gravity while expressing humanity's reaching toward the divine. The architects of Amiens Cathedral, working with mathematical precision and spiritual vision, create spaces that transform worshippers into pilgrims journeying toward transcendence. The art of the garden, the human attempt to create paradise on earth, flourishes in both monastic and secular settings. The herb gardens of the Abbey of St. Gall, with their careful arrangement of medicinal and culinary plants, become models for the integration of practical necessity with aesthetic beauty. These gardens, enclosed by walls and crossed by graveled paths, serve as outdoor chapels where the beauty of creation offers its own form of prayer. These quiet shifts in culture and thought began to pave the way for a gentle reordering of society structures. Let's softly transition now to how the very foundations of power began to quietly adjust. As the quiet currents of change moved through the fabric of medieval Europe, even the structures of power and governance began to gently adapt. Imagine the quiet discussions in castle chambers, the subtle rebalancing of authority. In the great hall of Kenilworth Castle, where tapestries depicting the achievements of past kings hang like memories made manifest, Earl Simon convenes his council with the same ceremony his ancestors have observed for generations. Yet the conversations that echo beneath the vaulted ceiling address questions that have no precedent in the wisdom of the past. The relationship between lord and vassal, that fundamental bond that has structured feudal society since the time of Charlemagne, requires new definitions as circumstances reshape the landscape of obligation and opportunity. The morning sun streams through tall windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the polished oak table where documents bearing royal seals await the Earl's attention. These parchments, written in the careful script of royal clerks, record grants of land and privilege that reflect the Crown's recognition of changed realities. The language remains traditional. Phrases like "by the grace of God" and "in perpetuity" carry the weight of centuries. But the practical arrangements they formalize acknowledge new relationships between ruler and subject. Master Geoffrey, the Earl's Chancellor, whose training in the law schools of Bologna has prepared him for the complexities of medieval jurisprudence, explains the implications of each document with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a scholar. His understanding of both canon and civil law allows him to navigate the intricate web of rights and obligations that bind together the medieval world, while his practical experience helps him identify opportunities for beneficial adaptation. The English Parliament, that innovative institution that brings together representatives of the nobility, clergy, and commons, convenes in Westminster Hall with ceremonies that honor tradition while embracing change. The Great Hall, where William the Conqueror once held court, echoes with debates conducted in Norman French, Latin, and increasingly in the English vernacular. The Knights of the Shires, elected by their counties to represent local interests, bring perspectives that had rarely been heard in the councils of the mighty. Sir Robert de Montfort, representing the Shire of Leicester, speaks with the authority of one who understands the daily realities of rural life. His words, delivered in the measured cadences of a man accustomed to being heard, reflect the concerns of farmers and craftsmen who have discovered new bargaining power in their relationships with their social superiors. The petitions he presents, written on parchment and authenticated with seals, request modifications to ancient customs that no longer serve the common good. The royal court of France, that glittering center of medieval power where etiquette has been refined to an art form, adapts its practices to serve a realm where traditional hierarchies have softened around the edges. King Philip's daily routine, from his morning prayers in the royal chapel to his evening consultations with his most trusted advisors, continues to follow patterns established by his predecessors. Yet the substance of his decisions reflects awareness that effective governance requires flexibility as well as continuity. The Chancellor of France, that great officer of state who serves as the king's principal advisor on matters of law and administration, implements new policies with the careful deliberation that has always characterized royal government. His chancery, where royal letters are drafted and sealed, produces documents that maintain the dignity of royal authority while acknowledging the practical need for accommodation with subjects who have gained new leverage through changed circumstances. The city-states of Italy, those remarkable experiments in urban governance that have transformed merchant communities into political entities, develop new forms of republican government that balance the competing interests of different social groups. In Florence, where the Arno River reflects the changing fortunes of families whose wealth derives from banking and trade, the Signoria meets in the Palazzo Vecchio to address challenges that require both business acumen and political wisdom. The merchant princes of Venice, whose maritime empire spans from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, adapt their commercial practices to serve markets where traditional relationships between buyers and sellers have evolved. The Doge, elected by his peers to serve as the ceremonial head of the Venetian state, presides over a system of government that combines democratic participation with aristocratic leadership in ways that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, that complex confederation of territories and principalities that spans much of Central Europe, experiences subtle shifts in the balance of power between emperors and princes. The imperial diet, where representatives of secular and ecclesiastical authorities gather to address matters of common concern, conducts its deliberations with the same formal ceremony that has characterized imperial government since the time of Charlemagne. Yet the practical outcomes of these meetings reflect new realities that require creative solutions to unprecedented challenges. The prince-bishops of Germany, those unique figures who combine ecclesiastical authority with temporal power, find themselves navigating relationships with subjects who have gained new importance through their specialized skills and economic contributions. The Bishop of Würzburg, whose cathedral city serves as both spiritual center and administrative capital, implements policies that honor his religious obligations while serving the practical needs of his territorial subjects. The emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe, where Christianity has taken root among peoples who have recently abandoned their pagan traditions, develop forms of government that blend indigenous customs with imported models of royal authority. The Kingdom of Poland, where the Piast dynasty has established its authority over tribes that once lived in autonomous communities, creates institutions that serve both the needs of royal administration and the desires of subjects who value their traditional freedoms. The Spanish kingdoms, engaged in the long process of reconquest that seeks to reclaim territory from Muslim rule, adapt their military and administrative practices to serve the needs of frontier societies where survival depends on cooperation across traditional social boundaries. The military orders, those communities of warrior monks who combine religious devotion with military service, develop forms of governance that honor their monastic vows while serving the practical needs of territorial administration. The Kingdom of Scotland, where Highland clans maintain their ancient customs while acknowledging the authority of the Scottish crown, creates hybrid forms of government that respect tribal traditions while building the institutions necessary for effective royal administration. The clan chiefs, whose authority derives from kinship and tradition, find themselves serving as intermediaries between their people and a royal government that seeks to extend its influence throughout the kingdom. The legal systems of medieval Europe, those complex structures of custom and statute that regulate relationships between individuals and communities, undergo gradual modification as jurists apply traditional principles to new circumstances. The law schools of Bologna and Paris, where the rediscovered texts of Roman law are studied alongside the growing body of canon law, produce graduates who understand both the theoretical foundations of legal authority and the practical requirements of effective governance. The guild systems that regulate craft production and commercial activity in medieval cities develop new forms of self-governance that serve both the interests of their members and the broader needs of urban communities. The guilds of London, meeting in their magnificent halls that will survive into the modern era, create policies that balance the protection of traditional privileges with the need to adapt to changing market conditions. The agricultural communities of medieval Europe, those village societies that have maintained their traditional forms of collective decision-making for centuries, find new relevance for their democratic practices as circumstances require increased cooperation and mutual support. The village assemblies, where free men gather to make decisions that affect their common life, develop new procedures for addressing challenges that have no precedent in customary law. The monasteries, those spiritual communities that have preserved learning and maintained charitable services throughout the medieval period, adapt their administrative practices to serve expanded roles in their surrounding communities. The abbots and abbesses, elected by their communities to provide both spiritual leadership and temporal administration, find themselves managing resources and relationships that extend far beyond the walls of their monasteries. The universities, those new institutions that have emerged to serve the educational needs of an increasingly complex society, develop forms of governance that balance the authority of church and state with the autonomy necessary for intellectual inquiry. The University of Paris, that mother of universities whose graduates serve in courts and churches throughout Europe, creates precedents for academic freedom that will influence educational institutions for centuries to come. The papal court at Avignon, where the successors of St. Peter maintain their spiritual authority while navigating the complex political realities of medieval Europe, adapts its diplomatic practices to serve a church that must function effectively in a changing world. The papal chancery, where documents affecting the governance of Christendom are drafted and authenticated, produces letters and bulls that maintain the dignity of papal authority while acknowledging the practical needs of effective ecclesiastical administration. The emerging system of international diplomacy, where kingdoms and principalities conduct their relations through formal embassies and negotiated agreements, develops new protocols that honor traditional concepts of sovereignty while creating mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes. The treaties negotiated by royal ambassadors, authenticated with elaborate seals and written in multiple languages, establish precedents for international law that will influence European politics for centuries. With these gentle adjustments in governance, a new sense of communal quietude began to settle. Let's explore now how people found comfort and connection in new ways. After the quiet passage of time, a gentle healing began to unfold across the land. Imagine the soft hum of renewed community spirit, the quiet acts of helping hands, as people in medieval Europe gently reconnected and supported one another. Like morning mist slowly lifting from peaceful valleys, the bonds between neighbors began to strengthen and reform in ways both familiar and wonderfully new. In the sleepy villages that dotted the countryside, something beautiful was quietly taking root. Where once there had been formal distances between lord and peasant, master and apprentice, a softer understanding began to emerge. Picture, if you will, the village baker sharing his remaining flour with the miller's widow, not out of obligation, but from a gentle recognition of shared humanity. These small acts of kindness, like pebbles dropped into still water, created ripples of connection that spread throughout entire communities. The local parish churches, those ancient stone sanctuaries with their weathered wooden doors, became more than places of worship. They transformed into quiet havens where people gathered not just for Sunday services, but for the simple comfort of being together. Imagine the soft conversations after evening prayers as candlelight flickered against stone walls, and neighbors who had once barely acknowledged each other now shared their hopes and concerns in hushed, gentle tones. In the monasteries and convents scattered across the landscape, a particular kind of healing was taking place. The brothers and sisters, with their quiet dedication to prayer and service, became beacons of stability in a world that had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Picture the gentle monks tending their herb gardens with renewed purpose, their knowledge of healing plants now more precious than ever. Their monastery walls, which had always offered sanctuary, now provided something even more valuable, a sense of continuity and hope for the future. The guilds, those associations of craftsmen and merchants, began to evolve in beautifully subtle ways. Where once apprentices might have waited years for recognition, masters now welcomed them with open arms and patient instruction. Imagine the quiet pride of a young carpenter finally being invited to sit at the guild table, or the gentle satisfaction of a weaver passing down techniques that had taken generations to perfect. These acts of inclusion weren't dramatic declarations, but soft acknowledgments that everyone's contribution mattered more than ever before. In the markets and town squares, a different rhythm began to emerge. The frantic competition of earlier times gave way to something more collaborative and gentle. Picture merchants who might once have been rivals, now sharing information about safe trade routes, or farmers pooling their resources to ensure everyone had seed for the next planting season. The market bells that rang out across the squares seemed to carry a different message now. Not just the call to commerce, but an invitation to community. Women, in particular, found their voices growing stronger in this new landscape. In households where they had quietly managed domestic affairs, their wisdom was now sought for larger decisions. Imagine the merchant's wife whose counsel on trade matters was no longer dismissed, or the peasant woman whose knowledge of healing herbs made her an invaluable member of her village community. These shifts happened gradually, like the slow brightening of dawn, but they were profound in their quiet significance. The art of storytelling experienced a gentle renaissance during this period. In the long winter evenings, as families and communities gathered around their hearths, the old tales took on new meaning. Picture the village elder sharing stories not just for entertainment, but as a way of preserving memory and hope. These narratives, passed down through generations, became threads that wove communities back together, creating a tapestry of shared experience and mutual understanding. Children, too, played a special role in this healing embrace. Their laughter, so resilient and pure, became a kind of medicine for communities that had grown too quiet. Imagine the joy that rippled through a village when the children organized their games in the common spaces, their voices carrying across the fields like birdsong. Adults who had forgotten how to play found themselves watching with gentle smiles, remembering their own childhoods and feeling hopeful about future generations. The practice of hospitality, always important in medieval culture, took on an almost sacred quality. Travelers were welcomed not just with food and shelter, but with genuine warmth and curiosity about the world beyond. Picture the pilgrim being invited to share stories of distant places, or the merchant finding himself treated more like family than a stranger. These acts of welcome created networks of connection that stretched across entire regions, binding communities together with invisible threads of kindness. Seasonal celebrations, too, evolved to reflect this new spirit of togetherness. The harvest festivals became more inclusive, with entire communities contributing what they could and sharing in the abundance. Imagine the gentle satisfaction of knowing that everyone would have enough for winter, not through individual hoarding, but through collective care and planning. The spring planting ceremonies took on new significance as well, becoming rituals of renewal that encompassed not just the crops, but the community's spirit itself. In the scriptoriums where monks laboriously copied manuscripts, a new emphasis emerged on recording not just religious texts, but the stories and wisdom of ordinary people. Picture the careful hands inscribing tales of courage and kindness, ensuring that the quiet heroes of these times would not be forgotten. These records became treasures not just of knowledge, but of human resilience and community spirit. The healing that took place wasn't just social, but deeply personal as well. Individuals who had learned to rely only on themselves discovered the profound comfort of interdependence. Imagine the widow who found new purpose in teaching young mothers, or the craftsman who discovered joy in sharing his skills freely rather than guarding them jealously. These transformations happened quietly, in the privacy of hearts and minds, but their effects rippled outward to touch entire communities. And so, with these quiet rediscoveries of strength and connection, the world of medieval Europe began to slowly, gently, move towards a new dawn, like a garden that has weathered a harsh winter and now shows the first tender shoots of spring. These communities had found ways to not just survive, but to flourish with a deeper appreciation for the bonds that held them together. Let's take our final soft steps now towards its lasting legacy. As our quiet journey nears its end, let us gently contemplate the lasting echoes of this profound period. The subtle shifts, the quiet transformations that rippled through medieval Europe, laid the foundations for a new horizon, a gentle unfolding of a different world. Like seeds planted in fertile soil, the changes we have explored together would slowly, patiently, grow into something remarkable and enduring. Picture, if you will, a young apprentice in Florence, perhaps 50 years after our story's quiet beginning. His hands work with newfound confidence as he sketches designs that would have seemed impossible to his grandfather. The economic shifts we witnessed, the rise in wages, the dignity of labor, have created a world where craftsmen dare to dream beyond mere survival. This is one of the gentle echoes, the quiet revolution that placed value on human skill and creativity in ways that had never existed before. In the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, scholars gather in halls where candlelight flickers against ancient stone. Their discussions, though conducted in hushed tones suitable for reverent learning, carry the seeds of revolutionary thinking. The plague's questions about mortality, meaning, and human purpose have evolved into philosophical inquiries that will eventually bloom into the Renaissance. Imagine these learned men, their voices soft with contemplation, unknowingly nurturing ideas that will reshape how humanity sees itself. The banking houses of Florence and Venice hum with quiet activity, their ledgers recording transactions that span continents. The economic rebalancing that began in our story has created new opportunities for trade and commerce. Picture the merchant families, no longer bound by the rigid hierarchies of earlier times, building networks of exchange that connect distant lands. Their success stems not from dramatic conquest, but from the patient cultivation of trust and mutual benefit, another gentle echo of the transformative period we have explored. In the countryside, where our story began with quiet fields and sleeping farmhouses, a different landscape has emerged. The tenant farmers who once worked land they could never own now possess deeds to their own plots. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a man walking his own furrows at dawn, knowing that his children will inherit not just his labors, but the very earth beneath their feet. This transformation of land ownership, born from the demographic shifts of our period, creates stability that will endure for generations. The guilds, those associations of craftsmen that we saw embracing new members with gentle welcome, have evolved into something approaching modern professional organizations. Picture the master goldsmith teaching his techniques not as jealously guarded secrets, but as knowledge to be shared and improved upon. The collaborative spirit born from necessity has become a tradition of innovation and mutual support that will drive technological advancement for centuries to come. In the scriptoriums and libraries, where monks continue their patient work of copying and preserving knowledge, something remarkable is quietly taking shape. The increased literacy rates, born from practical necessity during our transformative period, have created a hunger for books and learning that extends far beyond the monastery walls. Imagine the soft rustle of pages as merchants' daughters learn to read, or the gentle satisfaction of a farmer's son mastering numbers. This democratization of knowledge, subtle but profound, will eventually lead to the printing press and the spread of ideas across all levels of society. The artistic expressions we witnessed, the contemplative paintings, the introspective literature, have matured into movements that will define European culture. In the workshops of artists, the themes of human dignity and spiritual reflection continue to evolve. Picture the quiet concentration of a painter working on a portrait that captures not just physical likeness, but the inner life of his subject. The plague's emphasis on individual mortality has paradoxically created a new appreciation for individual human worth that will flourish in the arts for generations. The medical knowledge that emerged from practical necessity during our period has grown into a more systematic understanding of health and healing. In the monasteries that served as hospitals, careful records are being kept of treatments and outcomes. Imagine the gentle dedication of the monks and nuns who tend the sick, their notebooks filled with observations that will eventually contribute to genuine medical advancement. Their quiet empiricism, born from compassion, represents one of the earliest movements towards scientific medicine. The political structures that adapted so quietly to changed circumstances have stabilized into new forms of governance. The relationship between rulers and subjects, softened by mutual dependence, has created space for concepts of representation and consent that were previously unimaginable. Picture the quiet negotiations in castle halls, where lords who once ruled by divine right now find themselves consulting with representatives of their people. These gentle accommodations will eventually blossom into more democratic forms of government. The spiritual life of Europe, too, has been quietly transformed. The intensely personal relationship with faith that emerged during our period has created new forms of religious expression. In small chapels and grand cathedrals alike, a more individualized devotion has taken root. Imagine the private prayers of a merchant's wife, no longer mediated entirely by clerical authority, or the quiet contemplation of craftsman who finds the divine in the work of his hands. This personal spirituality will eventually contribute to religious reforms that reshape Christianity itself. The international connections forged by necessity during the plague years have evolved into permanent networks of communication and exchange. The Italian city-states maintain correspondence with merchants in London. Scholars in Cologne correspond with their colleagues in Vienna, and artistic techniques spread freely across national boundaries. Picture the gentle flow of ideas and innovations, like water finding its level, creating a truly European culture that transcends local boundaries. Perhaps most profoundly, the demographic changes that seemed so challenging at the time have created a Europe where human life is valued more highly than ever before. The scarcity of people has led to their greater appreciation, and this change in perspective will influence law, philosophy, and social organization for centuries to come. Imagine a world where individual human potential is seen as precious, where education and opportunity are extended to people who might once have been overlooked. This quiet revolution in human worth may be the most lasting echo of all. The agricultural innovations born from necessity, the improved plows, the crop rotation systems, the selective breeding of livestock, have created food security that supports larger populations and more complex societies. Picture the peaceful abundance of harvest time, when granaries fill with surplus that can support not just farmers, but artists, scholars, and inventors. This agricultural foundation will enable all the other cultural and intellectual developments that follow. Even the architecture of Europe bears the gentle marks of transformation. The castles built in this new era blend defensive necessity with domestic comfort in ways that previous generations never imagined. Churches incorporate more light, more space for congregational participation, reflecting the changed relationship between clergy and laity. Picture these buildings as physical manifestations of social change, their stones holding within them the aspirations of a transformed society. As we reach the end of our quiet journey, we can see how the subtle transformations of our period have created not just a new Europe, but a new understanding of what human society can become. The gentle resilience, the quiet adaptations, the patient rebuilding we have witnessed have laid the groundwork for centuries of cultural flowering. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, all of these great movements trace their roots back to the quiet changes we have explored together. And perhaps this is the most comforting thought of all, that even in times of great challenge, the human spirit finds ways not just to survive, but to grow, to adapt, to create something beautiful from the ashes of the old. The people of medieval Europe, with their quiet courage and gentle persistence, have shown us that transformation, though sometimes difficult, can lead to possibilities they could never have imagined. And so, our story softly concludes, leaving us with a gentle sense of wonder at the quiet power of history. The echoes of that distant time continue to resonate today in our democratic institutions, our scientific methods, our artistic traditions, and our fundamental belief in human dignity. As these final thoughts drift away, allow yourself to simply rest, knowing that you are part of this continuing story, this gentle unfolding of human possibility that began so long ago in the quiet fields and sleeping villages of medieval Europe. As we continue our gentle journey through time, imagine now the soft morning light filtering through the windows of a quiet scriptorium in Florence, or perhaps Venice, where the air itself seems to hum with a different kind of energy. The world we explored in our previous chapters, that medieval Europe touched by profound change, has begun to quietly transform once more. Like seeds that have rested through a long winter, new ideas are beginning to gently stir beneath the surface of this transformed landscape. Let your mind drift now, as we explore this soft awakening, this quiet renaissance of thought and beauty that emerged from the gentle ashes of the old world. The word Renaissance itself whispers of rebirth, of quiet renewal. And indeed, something beautiful was beginning to unfold across the European continent. Not with fanfare or sudden drama, but with the slow, almost imperceptible grace of dawn breaking across sleeping hills. The profound changes wrought by the Black Death, those subtle shifts in economics, social structures, and spiritual contemplation that we've gently explored, had created fertile ground for something entirely new to bloom. In the quiet chambers of wealthy merchants' homes, in the peaceful cloisters of reformed monasteries, and in the gentle workshops of skilled artisans, a different kind of thinking was beginning to take root. The harsh certainties of the old medieval world had been softened, questioned, and in many ways, gently set aside. Where once there had been rigid hierarchies and unquestioned traditions, now there was space, quiet, contemplative space, for new ideas to breathe and grow. Let us drift now, like gentle morning mist, into these spaces where new thoughts were beginning to form, where the human spirit, having weathered such profound change, was quietly discovering new ways to express its deepest longings. Picture, if you will, a quiet villa on the rolling hills outside Florence. The late afternoon sun casts long, golden shadows across the terrace gardens, and inside, a small group of learned men, merchants, clerics, and scholars, sit in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing gentle observations about beauty, about the nature of human experience, about the quiet dignity they see in both ancient texts and in their daily lives. This is how humanism was born, not in grand proclamations, but in these soft conversations, these gentle questionings. The survivors of that great medieval transformation had learned something profound about the preciousness of human life, about the fleeting nature of earthly existence. But rather than turning away from the world in despair, they began to embrace it with a new kind of gentle reverence. They started to see beauty not just in the divine, but in the curve of a human form captured in marble, in the play of light across a painted landscape, in a melodic flow of poetry written not in learned Latin, but in the warm, familiar rhythms of their native tongues. This was the quiet magic of early Renaissance thinking. It didn't reject the spiritual world that had sustained medieval Europe, but instead began to see the sacred gently woven into the fabric of everyday human experience. The artists of this period weren't trying to shock or revolutionize. They were simply trying to capture, with patient, loving attention, the quiet beauty they discovered in being human. And so, as these new ways of seeing began to take root, the very nature of artistic expression started to quietly evolve. Let us drift now into those peaceful workshops where hands guided by new vision began to create wonders that still whisper to us across the centuries. In the gentle workshops of Florence, of Venice, of the quiet towns scattered across northern Italy, something beautiful was stirring. The concentrated wealth that had emerged from the demographic changes following the Black Death meant that more people could afford to commission art, to support musicians, to sponsor the quiet work of creating beauty. But this patronage wasn't born of ostentation. It grew from a deep, almost spiritual need to surround themselves with reminders of life's quiet magnificence. Imagine Brunelleschi, in the soft early morning light, carefully studying the ancient Roman ruins, not to copy them exactly, but to understand their gentle principles of harmony and proportion. Picture young Donatello's hands moving slowly, thoughtfully over clay, discovering how to capture not just the outer form of the human body, but somehow, mysteriously, the quiet dignity of the human soul that dwelt within. These artists weren't working in isolation. They were part of a gentle community of thinkers and creators who supported each other's quiet explorations. They would meet in peaceful gardens, share their discoveries over simple meals, discuss their ideas in the soft evening air. There was a sense of collective awakening, of a whole culture slowly opening its eyes to new possibilities. The manuscripts of this period tell us stories not just through their words, but through their gentle illuminations. The margins that had once been filled with stylized, symbolic decorations began to bloom with carefully observed flowers, with tiny birds rendered with loving attention to detail, with landscapes that captured the actual light and shadow of real places. It was as if the artists were saying, quietly but firmly, that the natural world deserved the same reverent attention that had once been reserved only for religious subjects. As this gentle appreciation for earthly beauty continued to grow, it began to influence not just how people created art, but how they thought about knowledge itself. Let us drift now into those quiet spaces where learning was being transformed. The great libraries and universities of this period were undergoing their own quiet transformation. The intense focus on theological debate that had characterized medieval scholarship began to expand, like a gentle stream flowing into a wider river. Scholars started to rediscover ancient Greek and Roman texts, not as curiosities, but as sources of wisdom about how to live fully human lives. But this wasn't a rejection of faith. It was more like a gentle expansion of what faith could encompass. The humanist scholars of the early Renaissance saw no contradiction between loving God and appreciating the beauty of classical poetry, between seeking salvation and studying the natural world with careful, scientific attention. They developed what we might call a quietly inclusive spirituality, one that could hold both the sacred and the secular in gentle balance. In the peaceful scriptoriums where these scholars worked, copying and translating ancient texts, there was a sense of participating in something larger than themselves. They weren't just preserving old knowledge. They were quietly preparing the foundation for new ways of understanding the world. Each carefully copied page, each gentle translation from Greek or Arabic into Latin or the vernacular languages, was like planting a seed that would bloom in the minds of future generations. The invention of printing, which began to spread quietly across Europe during this period, meant that these ideas could reach more people than ever before. But even this technological revolution happened gradually, peacefully. The first printed books were often devotional texts, classical works, gentle treatises on how to live a good life. Knowledge was becoming democratized, but in a soft, organic way that built on the changes that had been slowly developing since the transformative years of the Black Death. And so, as we prepare to drift away from this quiet awakening, this gentle renaissance of human possibilities, let us pause to appreciate how beautifully the seeds of change, planted in those difficult medieval years, had begun to bloom into something that celebrated both human dignity and divine mystery. As our exploration of this chapter draws to its peaceful close, we can see how the profound changes of the medieval period, those quiet transformations in social structure, economic opportunity, and spiritual understanding, had created the perfect conditions for this gentle cultural flowering. The Renaissance wasn't a sudden break with the past, but rather a soft, natural evolution, like a flower that finally blooms after a long season of patient growth. The people of this period had learned, through their ancestors' experience of loss and renewal, that life was both precious and fragile, both sacred and beautifully human. This knowledge infused their art with a quiet depth, their scholarship with gentle wisdom, their daily lives with a more conscious appreciation for beauty and meaning. As we let these images fade, the peaceful workshops, the quiet libraries, the gentle conversations in garden courtyards, we can rest in the knowledge that even in times of great change and challenge, the human spirit finds ways not just to survive, but to create, to grow, to discover new depths of beauty and meaning. Let these gentle visions of cultural awakening accompany you now as you sink deeper into peaceful rest, knowing that from the seeds of every ending, new beginnings quietly grow. Drift with me now into the quiet halls of ancient learning, where stone corridors echo softly with the whispered turning of parchment pages. Imagine the gentle glow of candlelight dancing across weathered wooden desks, where scholars bend over manuscripts with the patient devotion of gardeners tending delicate seedlings. We find ourselves now in the transformed world of medieval European learning, where the profound changes we've gently explored together have begun to reshape not just how knowledge is preserved, but how it flows like a quiet river from one generation to the next. Let your mind settle into this peaceful realm of contemplation, where wisdom moves with the unhurried grace of seasons changing, and where the very nature of understanding itself has begun its own quiet metamorphosis. The great transformation that had swept across medieval Europe, that slow, profound shift we've witnessed through our previous chapters, had touched every aspect of life, and perhaps nowhere was this change more beautifully evident than in the quiet evolution of learning itself. The medieval world had treasured knowledge, yes, but it had held it closely, carefully, like precious gems locked away in monastery vaults. Now, like morning mist gradually lifting to reveal new landscapes, a different approach to wisdom was beginning to emerge. In the hushed scriptoriums of rebuilt monasteries, something subtle yet revolutionary was taking place. The monks who had once devoted their lives solely to copying sacred texts began to expand their gentle labors. Ancient Greek manuscripts, long neglected in dusty corners, were being brought forth into the soft candlelight. Arabic treatises on mathematics and astronomy, once viewed with suspicion, were now being carefully translated with the same reverent attention once reserved only for biblical passages. Picture Brother Thomas, his weathered hands moving slowly across a partially translated work of Aristotle, pausing occasionally to gaze out the narrow window at the peaceful countryside beyond. The world outside had changed, the social structures, the very rhythm of daily life. And with it, the relevance of different kinds of knowledge had shifted too. Where once the monastery's primary concern had been preserving divine wisdom for the afterlife, now there was a growing awareness that understanding the natural world, human nature, and practical skills could serve both earthly and spiritual purposes. Let us drift now, like gentle morning light, into those spaces where new approaches to learning were taking root, where the boundaries between sacred and secular knowledge were beginning to soften and blur. The great universities of medieval Europe, Paris, Oxford, Bologna, were experiencing their own quiet transformation. These venerable institutions, which had grown from cathedral schools and monastic foundations, were slowly opening their doors not just to future clerics, but to the sons of merchants, minor nobles, and skilled craftsmen whose families had prospered in the changed economic landscape following the great demographic shifts. Imagine walking through the peaceful courtyards of the University of Paris in the early morning hours. The cobblestones still glisten with dew, and the soft murmur of Latin conversations drifts from open windows. But listen carefully. Interwoven with the traditional theological debates, you can hear new topics being discussed with equal seriousness. Natural philosophy, what we might now call science, is being explored with patient curiosity. The movement of the stars, the properties of herbs, the mechanics of water wheel construction, all of these are becoming worthy of scholarly attention. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but rather a gentle expansion, like circles slowly spreading across the surface of a still pond. The traditional curriculum remained, but was being enriched, supplemented, and slowly transformed by practical considerations. Students still studied theology and philosophy, but they also began to learn rhetoric not just for sermon writing, but for effective communication in the growing world of commerce and diplomacy. The masters who taught in these institutions found themselves grappling with new questions. How should education serve not just the church, but the broader community? What knowledge would best prepare young men for lives that might be spent in bustling market towns rather than quiet monasteries? These weren't debates that raged with fierce intensity, but rather gentle conversations that unfolded over years, like the slow growth of wisdom itself. As these quiet changes took root in the great centers of learning, something equally profound was happening in the realm of language itself. Let us settle now into this softer revolution, where the very words people used to share knowledge began to transform. Perhaps one of the most beautiful transformations occurring during this period was the gentle emergence of vernacular literature, works written not in scholarly Latin, but in the warm, familiar languages that people spoke in their daily lives. This wasn't born from any rejection of Latin's importance, but rather from a growing recognition that wisdom deserved to be accessible to all who hungered for it. In quiet chambers across Europe, scholars were beginning to write in French, in Italian, in English, in German. They weren't abandoning their classical education, but rather serving as gentle bridges, carrying the treasures of ancient learning across the linguistic divide that had long separated the learned from the common people. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a scholar as he carefully crafted a translation of Aristotle's Ethics in a clear, beautiful French, knowing that merchants and craftsmen would soon be able to ponder the same profound questions about virtue and the good life that had occupied philosophers for centuries. This democratization of knowledge happened gradually, peacefully. The first vernacular works were often practical: treatises on agriculture, guides for merchants, collections of remedies for common ailments. But slowly, these expanded to include poetry, philosophical reflections, and even devotional works that allowed ordinary people to engage with spiritual ideas in their native tongues. The rise of vernacular literature also meant that different regions began to contribute their own unique perspectives to the broader conversation of European learning. The contemplative mysticism of German theological writing, the practical wisdom of Flemish commercial treatises, the lyrical philosophy of Italian humanist works, all of these began to enrich the common pool of European knowledge. Learning was becoming not just more accessible, but more diverse, more nuanced, more beautifully complex. As knowledge began to flow more freely across the boundaries of language and class, the very institutions of learning began to evolve in response. Let us drift now into those spaces where new forms of education were quietly taking shape. The transformation of learning wasn't confined to the ancient universities and monasteries. Across the changed landscape of medieval Europe, new kinds of educational institutions were beginning to emerge, as naturally as wildflowers blooming in a meadow after winter's end. These weren't grand foundations with royal charters, but rather modest, practical responses to the educational needs of a transformed society. In the larger towns that had grown prosperous through trade, guild schools began to appear. These institutions focused on practical skills: reading, writing, arithmetic, but they did so with a dignity and thoroughness that elevated even the most mundane subjects. A merchant's son learning to calculate percentages and exchange rates wasn't just acquiring technical skills. He was participating in the broader human project of understanding and organizing the world. Picture a small school above a baker's shop in a thriving market town. The master, perhaps a former monastery student who had chosen the world over the cloister, guides a dozen boys through the gentle discipline of learning. They practice their letters by copying not just prayers, but also contracts, inventories, and correspondence. They learn arithmetic not through abstract exercises, but by solving the kinds of problems they'll face as adults in a world of commerce and craft. These schools represented something beautifully democratic about the transformation of learning. Education was no longer the exclusive province of those destined for religious life. It was becoming a practical necessity for anyone who hoped to thrive in the increasingly complex world that had emerged from the great changes of the previous centuries. Even more revolutionary, though it happened so quietly that few remarked upon at the time, was the gradual inclusion of women in certain forms of education. While they were still excluded from the universities, women in prosperous merchant families often learned to read and write, sometimes in multiple languages. The correspondence of the period reveals wives and daughters who were not just literate, but actively engaged in literary and philosophical conversations with their male relatives. As these new patterns of education took root and flourished, they began to create something unprecedented, a broader community of learning that stretched across traditional boundaries. Let's explore now how this quiet revolution was reshaping the very nature of intellectual life. The transformation of learning in post-plague Europe created something that would have been almost unimaginable in the earlier medieval period. Networks of correspondence and intellectual exchange that connected scholars, merchants, craftsmen, and even some women across vast distances. These weren't formal institutions, but rather organic communities that grew naturally from the increased literacy and the practical needs of a more complex society. Imagine letters traveling along the same trade routes that had once carried news of distant troubles, but now carrying philosophical questions, scientific observations, and gentle debates about the nature of virtue and the best way to live. A university master in Paris might correspond with a merchant scholar in Venice, who in turn shared ideas with a reformed monk in the Low Countries, who passed along insights to a guild master in London. Knowledge was becoming networked, interconnected, beautifully collaborative. This networking of learning wasn't just about sharing information. it was creating new forms of knowledge itself. When a practical craftsman's observations about metalworking were combined with a scholar's theoretical understanding of natural philosophy, innovations emerged that neither could have achieved alone. When a merchant's experience with foreign languages and customs was paired with a university graduate's knowledge of classical rhetoric, new forms of diplomacy and international understanding became possible. The slow revolution in learning was also changing the very concept of expertise. In the earlier medieval period, authority had been largely hierarchical. Knowledge flowed down from established masters to humble students. Now, while respect for traditional learning remained strong, there was a growing recognition that valuable insights could come from unexpected sources. A farmer's careful observations of weather patterns might contribute as much to understanding the natural world as a scholar's commentary on Aristotle's meteorology. As we prepare to let these gentle visions of transformed learning drift away into peaceful rest, let us pause to appreciate how beautifully the seeds of change had blossomed into new ways of sharing and preserving human wisdom. The transformation of learning in medieval Europe following the great changes of the Plague Years represents one of humanity's most beautiful examples of turning challenge into opportunity. The demographic and social shifts that could have led to the loss of knowledge instead sparked its democratization and expansion. The disruption of traditional hierarchies created space for new voices and new perspectives. What emerged wasn't a rejection of the past, but rather a gentle incorporation of it into a broader, more inclusive vision of what human learning could become. The monastic traditions of careful preservation were joined by humanist ideals of accessibility and practical application. The theological focus on ultimate questions was enriched by scientific curiosity about immediate ones. The Latin inheritance of classical learning was complemented by the vernacular expressions of living cultures. Perhaps most beautifully, this transformation of learning helped create communities of understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries of class, occupation, and even gender. While these communities were still far from perfect in their inclusiveness, they represented a significant step toward recognizing that the capacity for wisdom and insight was a gift distributed broadly throughout humanity, not confined to any single group or institution. As we let these images fade, the quiet scriptoriums with their expanded collections, the bustling guild schools with their practical wisdom, the networks of correspondence carrying ideas across continents, we can rest in the knowledge that even in times of great change, the human hunger for understanding finds new and beautiful ways to express itself. Let these gentle visions of learning transform to accompany you now into deeper rest, knowing that wisdom, like water, always finds a way to flow toward those who thirst for it. Allowing your mind to drift as peacefully as knowledge itself drifts across the quiet bridges of time. As we reach the gentle conclusion of our long, quiet journey through medieval Europe's transformation, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast, peaceful valley at twilight. The last golden rays of sunlight illuminate the distant hills, where ancient stone churches and forgotten villages rest in eternal slumber. But listen carefully. Carried on the soft evening breeze, you can hear something extraordinary, the eternal whisper of the past speaking directly to our present moment. This isn't the voice of distant history, cold and academic, but rather the warm, living breath of human experience that connects us across the centuries like an unbroken chain of gentle understanding. Tonight, as we draw our exploration to its peaceful close, we'll discover how the quiet lessons learned by our medieval ancestors during their great transformation continue to echo in our modern world, offering us the same comfort, wisdom, and hope that sustain them through their times of profound change. There is something profoundly soothing about recognizing that we are not alone in our human experience, that the challenges we face, the hopes we cherish, and the quiet courage we must sometimes summon have all been faced, cherished, and summoned by countless generations before us. The people of medieval Europe who lived through the great transformation we've gently explored together were not fundamentally different from us. They loved their families, worried about their futures, found joy in simple pleasures, and search for meaning in the midst of uncertainty, just as we do today. When we look closely at their responses to profound change, the way they adapted their communities, reimagined their economic relationships, and found new forms of spiritual comfort, we can see reflected our own deepest capacities for resilience and renewal. Their story is not just history. It is a gentle mirror held up to our present moment, showing us possibilities we might not have imagined for navigating our own times of transition and challenge. The quiet courage they displayed in rebuilding their communities after devastation speaks directly to our modern experiences of recovery and renewal. Whether we're healing from personal loss, community tragedy, or global disruption, their example shows us that it's possible to emerge from difficulty not just intact, but somehow more deeply connected to what truly matters. They learned to find strength not in rigid adherence to old ways, but in flexible adaptation guided by enduring values of compassion, mutual support, and shared humanity. Let us drift now into this gentle recognition of connection across time, where the wisdom of centuries past offers its quiet guidance to our contemporary hearts and minds. Perhaps nowhere is this eternal whisper more clearly audible than in the realm of community building and mutual care. The medieval people we've come to know through our journey discovered, often through painful necessity, that true security comes not from individual accumulation, but from a strength of communal bonds. The way they restructured their villages and towns after demographic upheaval, creating new forms of cooperation, sharing resources more equitably, and developing systems of mutual support, offers profound insights for our modern communities. In our contemporary world, where many people feel isolated despite being more connected than ever through technology, the medieval model of intimate, interdependent communities speaks with particular relevance. Their guild systems, which provided not just economic organization, but social identity and mutual support, remind us that meaningful work is most fulfilling when it connects us to others and contributes to something larger than ourselves. Picture a modern neighborhood where people know each other's names, share resources during difficult times, and celebrate each other's successes with genuine joy. This isn't nostalgia for a simpler past, but rather an ancient wisdom about human flourishing that remains as true today as it was 7 centuries ago. The medieval understanding that individual well-being and community health are inseparably intertwined offers gentle guidance for creating more resilient, compassionate societies in our own time. Their approach to economic life also whispers important truths to our modern ears. The way they began to value skilled labor more highly, to see work as an expression of human dignity rather than merely a means of survival, and to develop more equitable relationships between employers and workers provides inspiration for contemporary efforts to create more just and sustainable economic systems. The quiet revolution in their understanding of wealth, from viewing it primarily as a means of display to seeing it as a tool for community building and cultural creation, offers profound lessons for our modern relationship with material prosperity. Their growing recognition that true wealth lies in the cultivation of human potential and the creation of beauty speaks directly to contemporary conversations about meaning, purpose, and the good life. As we continue to listen to these eternal whispers from the past, let us explore how their spiritual insights continue to offer comfort and guidance across the centuries. The spiritual transformation experienced by medieval Europeans during their great period of change offers perhaps the most intimate connection to our contemporary search for meaning and purpose. Their movement away from rigid, fear-based religiosity toward a more personal, contemplative, and compassionate spirituality resonates deeply with modern spiritual seekers from all traditions. Their discovery that profound faith could encompass both transcendent mystery and earthly beauty, that loving God and appreciating the natural world were not contradictory, but complementary impulses, speaks to contemporary efforts to integrate spiritual practice with environmental consciousness and everyday life. The way they learn to find the sacred in ordinary experiences, in community relationships, and the patient work of daily life offers gentle guidance for anyone seeking to live with greater depth and intentionality. The contemplative practices that flourished during their period of transformation, the quiet meditation, the reflective reading, the patient attention to the present moment, are remarkably similar to the mindfulness practices that many people find helpful for navigating contemporary stress and uncertainty. Their understanding that inner peace requires regular, gentle attention to spiritual cultivation speaks directly to our modern recognition of the importance of mental health and emotional well-being. Perhaps most beautifully, their development of what we might call an inclusive spirituality, one that could honor traditional religious wisdom while remaining open to new insights and diverse perspectives, offers hope for our contemporary efforts to bridge religious and cultural divides. Their example shows us that it's possible to be deeply rooted in particular traditions while remaining genuinely open to learning from others. The way they learn to find hope and meaning even in the midst of profound uncertainty and loss provides particularly relevant guidance for our modern moment. Their discovery that suffering, while never welcome, can become a teacher that deepens compassion and strengthens resilience speaks to anyone who has faced significant challenges and wondered how to transform difficulty into wisdom. Let us turn now to perhaps the most practical wisdom they offer us, their insights about how to navigate change itself with grace and wisdom. The people of transformed medieval Europe became, by necessity, experts in adaptation and change management. Their experiences offer us a gentle masterclass in how to navigate periods of profound transition without losing our essential humanity or abandoning our core values. Their approach to change was neither resistant nor recklessly embracing, but rather what we might call discerning adaptation, carefully considering what needed to be preserved, what could be transformed, and what should be gently released. They learned to distinguish between the essential and the merely traditional, holding fast to values like compassion, justice, and community care, while remaining flexible about the particular forms these values might take. This wisdom speaks directly to our contemporary challenges of preserving what's truly valuable from our past, while adapting to new realities and opportunities. Their patience with the pace of transformation offers particularly important guidance for our fast-paced modern world. They understood that meaningful change happens gradually, organically, through countless small adjustments and gentle shifts in perspective. They didn't expect instant results or perfect solutions, but rather trusted that consistent effort in the right direction would eventually yield fruit. This patience extended to their relationships with each other during times of change. They learned to extend grace to those who adapted more slowly, to support those who struggled with new realities, and to celebrate small steps forward rather than demanding dramatic transformations. Their model of change as a community process rather than an individual achievement offers valuable guidance for families, organizations, and societies navigating their own periods of transition. Their understanding of resilience is also remarkably sophisticated and relevant to our modern context. They discovered that true resilience comes not from rigid strength that resists all pressure, but from flexible strength that can bend without breaking. They learned to build redundancy into their systems, multiple sources of food, multiple forms of community connection, multiple ways of finding meaning and purpose, so that the failure of any single element wouldn't destroy the whole. As we explore these final whispers from the past, let us consider how their insights about learning and growth continue to guide us toward wisdom. The transformation of learning and knowledge sharing that we explored in our previous chapter offers profound guidance for our contemporary information age. The medieval people's discovery that wisdom comes not just from formal education, but from the integration of different kinds of knowledge, theoretical and practical, traditional and innovative, local and universal, speaks directly to our modern need for holistic, interdisciplinary approaches to complex problems. Their development of learning communities that transcended traditional boundaries offers inspiration for contemporary efforts to democratize education and create more inclusive spaces for intellectual growth. Their understanding that everyone has something valuable to contribute to the collective pool of human knowledge challenges modern tendencies toward academic elitism and expert worship. The way they learn to balance respect for traditional wisdom with openness to new insights provides guidance for navigating our contemporary tension between honoring the past and embracing innovation. They show us that it's possible to be both deeply rooted and genuinely progressive, both respectful of authority and committed to independent thinking. Their emphasis on practical application of knowledge, on learning that serves not just intellectual curiosity, but human flourishing, offers important correctives to purely academic approaches to education. They understood that the ultimate purpose of learning is to enhance our capacity to live well, to serve others, and to contribute to the common good. Their patient, incremental approach to the spread of knowledge reminds us that lasting educational transformation happens through sustained effort over time rather than through dramatic reforms or technological fixes. They trusted that making knowledge more accessible and relevant would gradually transform society in positive ways, and their patience with this gradual process offers guidance for contemporary educational reformers. As our long, gentle journey through time begins to draw to its peaceful close, let us gather these eternal whispers into a quiet symphony of wisdom that can accompany us forward into our own unknown futures. The greatest gift that medieval Europe's transformation offers to our contemporary world is perhaps the simple recognition that profound change, even when it arrives uninvited and brings significant challenges, can also bring unexpected opportunities for growth, renewal, and deeper humanity. Their experience demonstrates that crisis, handled with wisdom and compassion, can become a catalyst for positive transformation that extends far beyond what anyone could have imagined at the time. They show us that it's possible to face uncertainty without despair, to adapt to new realities without losing our essential identity, and to build something beautiful from the materials that change provides. Their example reminds us that human beings have remarkable capacities for resilience, creativity, and mutual support that often lie dormant until circumstances call them forth. Their story whispers to us that we are part of a long chain of human experience, connected to countless generations who have faced their own challenges with courage, found their own forms of hope, and contributed their own gifts to the ongoing human story. This connection across time is not just intellectually interesting. It is spiritually sustaining, emotionally comforting, and practically empowering. When we face our own periods of transition and uncertainty, we can draw strength from their example. When we wonder whether positive change is possible, we can remember their patient, persistent work of transformation. When we feel overwhelmed by the pace of contemporary change, we can learn from their trust in gradual, organic processes of growth. Their quiet wisdom reminds us that the most important transformations often happen not through dramatic gestures, but through countless small acts of kindness. Daily choices to prioritize community over individual gain, patient work to build understanding across differences, and consistent commitment to values that honor both human dignity and the common good. And so, as these eternal whispers from medieval Europe fade into the peaceful silence of completed understanding, let us carry their gentle wisdom forward into our own times, knowing that we too are part of this beautiful, ongoing story of human resilience and renewal. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the transformed world of medieval Europe, we find ourselves not at a conclusion, but at a beginning, a threshold where past wisdom meets present possibility. The voices of those distant ancestors, carried to us across 7 centuries, remind us that we are never truly alone in our human experience. Their challenges may have taken different forms from ours, but their responses reveal the same eternal human capacities for adaptation, compassion, creativity, and hope that remain available to us today. Their legacy is not preserved in stone monuments or written chronicles alone, but in the living stream of human wisdom that flows from generation to generation, always available to those who pause long enough to listen. In our own times of change and uncertainty, we can hear their gentle encouragement. that it is possible to navigate difficulty with grace, to transform challenge into opportunity, and to emerge from even the most profound changes not just intact, but somehow more fully human. The eternal whisper they offer us is ultimately one of hope. Hope grounded not in naive optimism, but in tested human experience. They whisper to us that we have within us the same capacities they discovered in themselves. The ability to adapt without losing our essential identity, to change without abandoning our deepest values, to face uncertainty without succumbing to despair. As you sink now into peaceful rest, carry with you this gentle knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain of human resilience stretching back through the centuries, and that the wisdom learned by countless generations of thoughtful, caring people remains available to comfort, guide, and strengthen you in whatever changes your own life may bring. Sleep now in the peace of this eternal connection, knowing that the gentle wisdom of the past flows forward to meet you in each new dawn, and that you too will someday whisper hope and encouragement to future generations who will face their own moments of transformation with the same quiet courage that has sustained humanity across all the centuries of our shared story. And so, our quiet journey through the echoes of the Black Death in medieval Europe gently comes to a close. We have wandered together through 10 chapters of peaceful exploration, following the whispered transformations that rippled across a continent long ago. From the quiet fields where our story began, through the gentle ports where change first arrived, and into the sleeping villages where communities slowly, patiently rebuilt themselves into something new and beautiful. You've listened to the soft unfolding of history, not as a series of dramatic events, but as the gentle breathing of human civilization itself. We explored how the people of medieval Europe, with their quiet resilience and patient wisdom, transformed challenge into opportunity, loss into renewal, and uncertainty into the foundation for a brighter future. These weren't the actions of kings and generals, but the small, everyday choices of ordinary people who chose compassion over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. Through our peaceful journey, you've witnessed the subtle shifts that changed everything. The gradual rebalancing of economic life, the gentle strengthening of community bonds, the quiet blossoming of new forms of artistic expression, and the slow, patient emergence of ideas that would eventually reshape the world. Each transformation we explored was like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their origin, touching lives and communities across centuries. You've seen how the monasteries became centers of healing and learning, how the guilds opened their doors to new voices, how families rediscovered the art of storytelling around their hearths. You've witnessed the quiet courage of women finding their voices, the gentle wisdom of elders sharing their knowledge, and the resilient joy of children whose laughter helped communities remember how to hope again. Perhaps most importantly, you've experienced the profound truth that even in humanity's most challenging moments, the capacity for growth, adaptation, and renewal never truly disappears. The people of medieval Europe showed us that transformation, though sometimes difficult, can lead to possibilities we might never have imagined. Their gentle persistence, their quiet acts of kindness, their patient rebuilding of their world, these are the true heroic acts of history. As the final threads of our story weave themselves into the tapestry of your dreams, remember that you too are part of this continuing narrative. The values of human dignity, community cooperation, and quiet resilience that emerge from that distant time continue to flow through our world today. Every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every choice to build rather than tear down connects you to those patient souls who rebuilt their world with gentle hands and determined hearts. Let these peaceful images accompany you now into your dreams. The soft light of dawn breaking over quiet fields, the gentle bells of village churches calling communities together, the warm glow of hearth fires where stories are shared and bonds are strengthened. Feel the deep satisfaction of meaningful work, the comfort of genuine community, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that human beings, when faced with any challenge, have within them the wisdom and strength to create something beautiful. There is nothing more to think about now, nothing more to remember or analyze. Simply let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of your bed, feeling the gentle weight of history settling around you like a soft blanket. Your breathing slows, your muscles relax, and your mind drifts peacefully into the realm of dreams, perhaps carrying with it the quiet wisdom of those who came before us. May your sleep be deep and undisturbed, filled with gentle dreams of peaceful communities, quiet courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining this soft exploration of history's hidden wisdom. Until we meet again on another quiet journey through time, sleep peacefully, rest deeply, and dream gently.